In the records of Mason County, Kentucky, there is a thin folder that has never been fully explained. It sits in a courthouse annex in Maysville, 3 floors above the river, inside a steel cabinet that once belonged to the old clerk's office. The folder bears no case number on the outside. Inside are a handful of loose pages, a partial bill of costs, 2 sworn statements, and a single sheet of paper in a handwriting so small and even that it appears to have been pressed rather than written. That sheet contains one sentence that has been quoted, misquoted, and argued over for more than a century. "If the woman takes the light to wills, let her reach the grave." The sentence is undated, though a clerk's marginal note places it in the autumn of 1856. It is unsigned, but the hand was later identified by 3 separate witnesses as that of Jeremiah Coyle, a landowner whose property stood 12 miles southwest of Maysville, along the narrow ridge roads that fall away toward the Ohio River. The woman named in the sentence was not a member of his family. She was Temperance Webb, 33 years old, a seamstress held in bondage on the Coyle property, and known throughout the district for one thing above all others: she was permitted to attend burials. When a death occurred among the enslaved workers or among the poorer white families who lived along the creek, it was Temperance who measured the body, cut the cloth, stitched the mourning clothes, and walked behind the wagon to the grave. She carried a lantern. Everyone who lived within 5 miles recognized that lantern, a tin cylinder with a wire handle and a chimney blackened on one side. The incident that gave the folder its importance began on the night of the 6th of November, 1856. 3 adults had disappeared from the Coyle property 2 days earlier. 4 men had been hired to find them. And for nearly an hour before midnight, those 4 men followed a single moving light down a narrow road that led nowhere except to a private cemetery. This is what the documents say happened, and what they do not say. The gap between those 2 things is where the story has lived ever since. The Coyle property was not, by the standards of the region, a large operation. It produced tobacco, a little hemp, and enough corn and hay to keep its own animals and workers through the winter. The main house sat on a low rise, 2 stories of whitewashed timber with a stone foundation and a porch that faced the river road. Behind it, arranged in a loose half-circle, stood the cabins of the enslaved workers, the smokehouse, the springhouse, the barn, and the stable block. Farther back beyond a split-rail fence, the ground sloped into a stand of oak and sycamore, and then fell sharply toward the creek bottom. A narrow lane, little more than 2 wheel ruts worn into the clay, ran from the stable yard along the edge of that slope for a little over a mile, before ending at the Coyle family cemetery, a fenced square of perhaps 30 graves set among the trees. There was nothing beyond the cemetery but a small spring, and past that, the unbroken woods. Jeremiah Coyle had inherited the property from his father in 1841, when he was 26 years old. By the autumn of 1856, he was a man of 41, widowed for 6 years, living alone in the main house except for the domestic workers who came and went each day. His 2 children had been sent to a school in Maysville and then to relatives in Lexington, and neither had returned to the property in more than 2 years. Neighbors described Coyle as a careful man, courteous in the way of someone who does not want to be remembered for any particular word he said. He kept his accounts in his own hand. He attended church irregularly. He paid his taxes on time. And he had, for several years, made a quiet practice of hiring men to recover the people who ran from his property, a practice that most of his neighbors knew about and none discussed openly. The man he hired most often was Harlan Kersey. Kersey was not from Mason County. He had come down from Bracken County some years earlier, worked for a time as a flatboat hand, and then as a timber estimator, and had gradually built a reputation as a man who could find people. He was 48 years old in 1856, lean, with a voice that witnesses described as low and unhurried. He kept a ledger of every job he took, and it was that ledger, more than anything else, that later made the folder in Maysville possible. Kersey wrote everything down: dates, distances, sums owed, sums paid, the names of informants, the routes he believed fugitives had taken. He did not write for posterity. He wrote because he had been cheated too many times by men who promised to pay and then claimed the work had been done poorly. His notes were his protection. The three men who vanished on the 4th of November had worked on the Coyle property in different capacities. The first was a field hand in his late 20s. The second was a man who drove the wagon between the property and Maysville, a route he knew in the dark and in every season. The third was a man who had once worked in a cooperage on the Maysville waterfront and who still knew the smell of wet oak and the men who moved barrels onto the river packets. Their names appeared differently in different documents. The bill of costs lists them only by the initials and ages that Kersey used in his ledger. The later testimony of the minister in Ohio gives two fuller names, but even those are recorded second-hand, decades after the fact. For the purposes of the record, the three were simply the ones who got away. The disappearance was noticed on the morning of the 4th. Two of the men had not reported to the fields. The third had not arrived with the wagon at the Maysville wharf, where a load of tobacco hogsheads was waiting to be collected. By noon, Coyle had sent word to Kersey. By nightfall, Kersey was on the property with 4 men, and the search had begun. It failed, as such searches often did, in the first 24 hours. The Ohio River was barely 3 miles away at its nearest point, and a man who reached the water in the dark had a dozen choices: the ferry, a skiff, a stolen flatboat, a friendly boatman, a sandbar crossing when the river ran low. Kersey set men at the known crossings, questioned the ferry operators, visited the small ports upstream and down. Nothing. On the 5th of November, he rode the ridge roads himself, checking the houses of free black boatmen and the cabins of families known to shelter the running. Still nothing. By the evening of the 5th, the trail, if there had ever been one, was cold. It was then that Kersey turned his attention to the people still on the property. This was his method, and he did not conceal it. Runaways did not simply walk into the dark. They needed food, water, clothing, and, above all, information. Which road was watched, which ferryman could be trusted, which stretch of river was shallow enough to wade. That information came from the people who stayed behind. Somewhere on the Coyle property, Kersey believed, there was a person who knew the route the 3 men had taken and who had probably helped plan it. Find that person, and the search could begin again with fresh ground. The person he suspected was Temperance Webb. The reasons were circumstantial, but they were not weak. Temperance moved through the property with unusual freedom. Her duties took her into the main house for fittings, into the cabins when someone had died, into Maysville for cloth and thread, and onto the cemetery road at all hours, because deaths did not keep convenient schedules. She knew every path, every gate, every time of day when a particular road would be empty. She also knew the river. The mourning cloth she needed was sometimes purchased from a shop in Maysville, and she had been seen, on more than one occasion, standing at the wharf with a bolt of black wool under her arm, watching the packets come and go as if she were memorizing their schedules. None of this proved anything. All of it made her, in Kersey's words, a woman who would know. On the evening of the 5th, Kersey questioned her. The account of that questioning survives only in fragments. Temperance, according to the later testimony of a stable hand, was called into the main house at dusk. She was asked where she had been on the night of the 3rd. She said she had been in her cabin, sewing a mourning dress for the widow of a man who had died on a neighboring farm. She was asked whether she had spoken to the 3 men in the days before their disappearance. She said she had spoken to everyone, as she always did. She was asked whether she knew anything of a plan to cross the river. She said she did not. Kersey, by his own later account, did not believe her, but he had no warrant, no witness, and no way to make her speak that would not damage the very information he needed. He let her go. That night, according to the minister's later record, Temperance returned to her cabin and did not sleep. She sat by the window with a needle in her hand and a piece of black cloth on her lap, and she waited. What she was waiting for arrived the next evening, on the 6th of November, in the form of a message. It came from one of the men Kersey had stationed at the river, a man who had stopped a young boy on the Maysville Road and paid him a few cents to carry word to the property. The message was short. The 3 fugitives had not been seen at any crossing. The river was being watched. Nothing had moved. Temperance learned of the message before most of the other workers did, because the boy who carried it stopped first at the kitchen door and spoke to the cook, Patience Rowe, and Patience Rowe told Temperance. That small piece of sequence mattered enormously later. It meant that by the time darkness fell on the 6th, Temperance knew 2 things with certainty. First, the hunters were still looking in the wrong place. Second, they would not stay in the wrong place forever. Eventually, Kersey would come back to the property, and when he did, he would come for her. She decided, that evening, to give him exactly what he expected to find. The details of what happened next were reconstructed years later from 3 overlapping sources: Kersey's own ledger and correspondence, the testimony given in the lawsuit that followed, and the account that Augustus Finch, many years afterward, gave to a minister in Ohio. None of the 3 sources is complete. Each was produced by a man with reasons to shade the truth. Read together, they form something close to a sequence, though the sequence has gaps, and the gaps are where the story lives. What is not in dispute is this. On the night of the 6th of November, shortly before 10 o'clock, Kersey and 3 of his men took up a position on the ridge road that ran past the Coyle property toward the river. They had been told by a source they trusted that someone would be moving that night. They did not know who, and they did not know why. They only knew to watch the cemetery road. At approximately 10 o'clock, a light appeared at the edge of the trees. Kersey described it later, in a statement that reads like the report of a man who had spent too many nights in the cold. The light was low to the ground and moved slowly, no faster than a walking pace, along the narrow lane that led from the stable yard toward the cemetery. It did not waver. It did not pause at the fence. It simply moved, steady and unhurried, as if the person carrying it had walked that road 1,000 times and had no reason to hurry. Kersey ordered his men to keep their distance. He did not want to flush the bearer into the woods. He wanted to see where the light stopped. For nearly 40 minutes the light moved through the trees. The men followed at a distance, staying off the lane, stepping from shadow to shadow along the edge of the woods. The night was cold and clear, with no moon behind the cloud cover, and the only sound was the scuff of their own boots on the frost. Twice the light stopped, and twice Kersey held his men still, waiting for it to move again. The second time it stopped, it remained still for a long while, and one of the men later said he had been certain they had been seen. But the light moved on. At last, it stopped, in the open ground, before the cemetery gate. The person carrying it was a woman. Kersey could see her clearly enough against the pale timber of the cemetery fence, a slight figure in a dark shawl, holding the lantern at her side. She opened the gate. She walked among the graves without hesitation, as if she knew exactly where she was going, and she stopped before a mound of earth that was still bare of grass, a grave so recent that the soil had not yet settled. She set the lantern down on the headstone beside the grave. She stood there perfectly still for what Kersey estimated to be several minutes. Then she turned and walked away from the light and in the space of a few steps she was gone into the dark beyond the spring, where the trees closed over the path. Kersey waited. He was certain now that the grave was the meeting point, and that the woman was the one who had arranged it. He did not follow her. He kept his men back, watching the lantern burning on the headstone, waiting for whoever was coming to meet it. They waited for a long time. The lantern burned down and no one came. Sometime before dawn, Kersey finally moved his men forward. They searched the cemetery, the spring, the edge of the woods, the ground on all four sides of the fence. They found footprints in the frost, but only one set, small and evenly spaced, leading back toward the property. They found no sign of the three fugitives, no food cache, no dugout hiding place, no marks of a wagon or horses. They found a grave and a lantern and nothing else. When the sun rose, Kersey was forced to confront a possibility he had not considered. The three men he was hunting had not come to the cemetery. They had not been near it. And by the time Kersey's men finished their search and began the long walk back to the property, the three fugitives had already crossed the Ohio River, miles away in the opposite direction, by a route that none of the hunters had been watching. The escape had succeeded. And it had succeeded, Kersey would later understand, because he and his men had spent the entire night in the one place they were absolutely certain held the answer. The days that followed were quiet on the Coyle property, in the particular way that follows a failure that no one is willing to name. The fields continued to be worked. The wagons continued to run. Coyle did not speak of the escape, at least not in any way that survived in the record. Kersey and his men remained in the district for several more days, checking and rechecking the river. But the trail was gone. The three men had vanished into the free state of Ohio, where the law would not help bring them back. The money Coyle had promised for their return was never paid. Kersey returned to Bracken County with his ledger and his bill of costs, and for a short time it appeared that the matter would end there, as so many such matters did, in silence and unpaid debt. It did not end there because Kersey could not let it go. The question that troubled him was not how the three men had escaped. That was, in the end, a simple matter of a river and a night, and men who knew the water. The question that troubled him was how Temperance Webb had known that he would be watching the cemetery road that night. He had not told her. He had not told anyone on the property. The information had come to him through a channel he considered secure, and yet somehow the one woman he most suspected had walked directly into his trap, led him and three armed men deep into the woods, and used their own certainty against them. She had not merely known they were there. She had counted on it. Kersey began, in the weeks that followed, to reconstruct the chain of information that had put him on that road, and the more he reconstructed it, the less sense it made. The information had come, he believed, from a man named Augustus Finch. Augustus Finch was 47 years old, a worker whose duties kept him near the stable block. He knew which wagons left the property, at what hour, and with what loads. He knew which horses were lame and which could be driven hard. He knew the comings and goings of the property better than almost anyone, except the wagon drivers themselves. And for some time before the 6th of November, there had been talk among the workers that Augustus was the one who passed information to the hunters. The talk was not without basis. On two previous occasions, escapes from the Coyle property had failed within hours of beginning. In both cases, the runaways had been caught before they reached the river, in places that suggested the hunters had known exactly where to wait. In both cases, the number of people who had known the plan in advance had been very small, and in both cases, Augustus Finch had been in a position to know because he worked the stables and saw everything that moved. Several of the adults on the property began to avoid him after the second failure. They would not stand near him at the well. They would not sit with him at the evening meal. When he passed, conversations stopped. in the way that conversations stop when a person has been judged and the judgment has not yet been spoken aloud. Augustus said nothing in his own defense. He simply kept working, kept his head down, and kept to the edge of the stable yard, as if he had already accepted the role that had been assigned to him. Temperance Webb did not accept it. She had watched the two failed escapes more closely than anyone realized, and something about them did not fit the simple explanation. The failures had been too clean. The hunters had been too well placed. A single informant, even one as well positioned as Augustus, could not have known everything that the hunters seemed to know. And there was another detail, small but persistent, that she could not make fit. On the night of the second failed escape, the hunters had arrived at a ford on the creek that even the runaways themselves had not decided to use until the last moment. No one could have told them where to wait, because no one had known where the runaways would go. The hunters had been waiting for movement, not for a specific route, and they had found it because they had been given enough information to know that movement was coming, and enough time to cover the likely ground. That was not the work of a single informant. That was the work of someone who understood the property as a whole, who saw patterns in the comings and goings of its people, and who could act on those patterns before they became plans. That was the work of someone who did not need to be told a secret because he could watch for the shape of the secret in the ordinary movement of the day. Temperance began, quietly and over a period of weeks, to test this idea. She did not confront Augustus. She did not defend him. She let the suspicion against him stand because the suspicion itself was useful. Instead, she began to speak to different people in different places about a supposed new escape. To Augustus, in the stable yard, she mentioned in passing that a crossing would be made by an old bridge, a structure that had been closed for years, but that still stood over a narrow stretch of the creek. To Patience Rowe, the cook, she mentioned a meeting near the mill, a place on the river road that would be empty after dark. And in the main house, during a fitting for a mourning dress that Coyle had ordered for a cousin, she allowed herself to be overheard saying that someone would be taking supplies to the cemetery after midnight. She said it carefully, in the way of a woman who did not want to be overheard, but who had not been careful enough. She said it once, and then she changed the subject, and she did not look at Coyle's face to see whether he had heard. The effect was immediate, and it was exactly what she had predicted. That same afternoon, Kersey's men took up positions on the cemetery road. When Temperance learned of it, the last piece of the puzzle fell into place. The leak had not come from Augustus Finch. The leak had come from Jeremiah Coyle himself. She understood then, with a clarity that she later described in fragments to the minister in Ohio, the full shape of what had been happening on the property. Coyle did not need to discover the true route of any escape. He did not need a single reliable informant who knew the plans. He needed only to collect the small, ordinary pieces of information that flowed through any household. Who had been seen talking to whom? Which tools had been taken from the barn? Whose shoes were muddy? Which cabin had burned its lamp late into the night? He needed to listen at doors and ask harmless questions and offer small rewards for any useful interpretation. And he needed one more thing, the thing that made the whole system work. He needed the workers to believe that one of their own was betraying them. That belief was the engine of the whole arrangement. As long as the workers suspected each other, they could not organize. As long as they believed there was an informant among them, they would keep their plans small, keep their conversations short, and keep their trust divided. A divided group could not run. A group that did not trust itself would betray itself before the hunters ever arrived. The informant, real or imagined, was worth more to Coyle than any single piece of information, because the fear of the informant did the work for him. Temperance had been watching this for years without being able to name it. Now she could name it, and once she could name it, she could turn it back against the man who had built it. The story of the cemetery that Coyle had overheard was false. It had been false from the beginning, a piece of bait designed to be overheard and passed along. Temperance had never intended to leave supplies at any grave. She had intended, from the moment she began to speak, to send the hunters to the cemetery road and to keep them there. The three fugitives, meanwhile, had not been near the cemetery at all. They had been waiting, miles away, on a different part of the river, for a signal that they had agreed upon in advance. That signal would come only after the hunters were seen entering the cemetery road, after their attention was fixed on a single point of light moving through the trees. The moment the hunters committed themselves to that road, the three men began to move toward the water. They crossed by a route that none of the hunters was watching. With the help of a man who had once worked the cooperage on the Maysville waterfront and who had, in the years since, kept contact with two free black boatmen who ran goods up to Cincinnati. Those boatmen were waiting at a sandbar south of the town, out of sight of the ferry and the patrols. By the time Kersey's men finished searching the cemetery, the boat was already mid-river, and the men aboard it were already beyond the reach of any law that Kentucky could send after them. Temperance did not need to escape with them. Her role in the plan was not to run. Her role was to be the light that the hunters could not look away from, to be the thing they were certain about, so that everything they were not certain about could happen in the dark. The choice of the grave was deliberate, and it was deliberate in a way that did not become clear until months later. The grave Temperance chose was that of Ephraim Wills. Ephraim Wills had died a few weeks before the escape, in the late summer of 1856, after a short illness that the property's record-keeper noted without comment. He was not, strictly speaking, a member of the Coyle household. He was a free white man who had worked for Jeremiah Coyle for many years as a wagon master, organizing the trips that carried tobacco, hemp, and supplies between the property, the wharves at Maysville, and the small river ports that dotted the Ohio between the two towns. He knew the roads better than anyone on the property. He knew the ferrymen, the boatmen, the toll keepers, the men who would carry a load for cash and ask no questions. For years, he had been the man who moved things from place to place without leaving a record of exactly what had been moved or for whom. Kersey, in the weeks after the escape, came to believe that Temperance had found something among Wills's belongings. He believed that Wills had kept notes or maps or lists of the men along the river who could be trusted with a clandestine load, and that Temperance had gone through his room after his death and found the key to a route that the hunters did not know. It was a reasonable theory, and Coyle shared it. On Coyle's order, the small room where Wills had lived, in a wing of the stable block, was emptied. Every drawer, every shelf, every box was searched. Nothing compromising was found. The room held a bed, a chair, a trunk of worn clothing, a tin of tobacco, a copy of a river almanac 2 years out of date, and a single drawer of papers that proved to be nothing more than old bills of lading. All of them accounted for, all of them innocent. The search found nothing, and that was exactly the point. The grave of Ephraim Wills had been chosen precisely because it hid nothing. Temperance had never found any map among Wills's belongings, because there had never been a map to find. She had chosen the grave because it was recent, because it belonged to a man whose work everyone knew involved the river, and because a recent grave was the most plausible place a hunter could imagine for a secret to be hidden. It was a location that made sense to men like Kersey, men who believed that every escape had a plan, and that every plan left a trace, and that every trace could be found if one only looked hard enough. The grave of a dead wagon master was the kind of place where such men would look for hours, because it was the kind of place where the secret ought to be. And so they looked. For the rest of the night, Kersey and his men dug at nothing and found nothing, and the whole time they were digging, the real plan was already finished. The revelation of how it had all worked came out, not in any confession, but in a lawsuit. Months after the escape, Harlan Kersey brought an action against Jeremiah Coyle in the Mason County Court, seeking payment for expenses and for rewards that had been promised and never delivered. The two men had fallen out. Coyle maintained that Kersey had failed to recover the three fugitives and was therefore owed nothing. Kersey maintained that he had performed the work agreed upon and that Coyle's own information had led him into the trap. The dispute was ordinary in its outlines, the kind of quarrel over money that filled the dockets of every county in Kentucky. But it produced an extraordinary piece of evidence because Kersey, in his anger, decided to prove that he had been misled. He brought his ledger into court, he brought his correspondence, and he brought a bundle of notes that he said had been provided to him by Jeremiah Coyle himself in the weeks and days before the escape, notes containing the information on which the hunters had acted. The notes were examined. Most of them were unremarkable. Observations about the movement of wagons, about a worker who had been seen near the river, about a horse that had been left saddled too long. But one of them stopped the proceeding cold. It was a single sheet, written in Coyle's small, even hand, and it contained the sentence that would follow both men for the rest of their lives. "If the woman takes the light to Wills, let her reach the grave." The meaning of the sentence was clear to everyone in the room. It proved that Jeremiah Coyle had known, hours before the pursuit, which grave would be watched. It proved that he had given specific instructions about the woman and the light and the grave by name. It proved that the entire episode on the cemetery road had been not a spontaneous response to a rumor, but an operation planned in advance, on the basis of information that Coyle had passed to the hunters. But the sentence proved something else as well, something that took longer to emerge. Jeremiah Coyle had known the name Ephraim Wills. He had known which grave to watch. He had known to write, "Let her reach the grave." The only question that remained was how he had known. The answer, when it came, seemed at first to point directly at Augustus Finch. Temperance Webb had never mentioned the name of Ephraim Wills anywhere near Jeremiah Coyle. She had been careful about that. The only person to whom she had revealed that particular detail, the name of the dead wagon master and the specific grave where the light would stop, was Augustus Finch. If Coyle knew the name, then Augustus must have told him. The logic was inescapable. The suspicion that had followed Augustus for months, the suspicion that Temperance had seemed to dismiss, now returned with the force of documentary proof. Augustus was confronted with the sentence, and it was then, in the course of that confrontation, that he said the thing that changed the entire understanding of the case. He admitted that he had repeated the information to Jeremiah Coyle. He admitted it openly, without hesitation, but he said that he had done so at the direct instruction of Temperance Webb. The two of them had been working together for weeks. The apparent suspicion between them, the coldness that the other workers had observed, the distance that Temperance had kept, all of it had been part of the plan. Temperance had needed Augustus to remain in the position of the suspected informant, because that position was the channel through which information reached Coyle. She had needed Coyle to trust the information that came through Augustus, and she had needed to test over and over how far that trust extended. She had needed to know not only whether Coyle passed information to the hunters, but how much of it he believed without verifying, how willing he was to act on a rumor, how completely he relied on the fear that divided his own workers. The answer, she had discovered, was that he believed almost everything and verified almost nothing. He had built a machine that collected whispers and turned them into action, and he had come to trust that machine so completely that he had forgotten how to check its work. The name of Ephraim Wills had been placed into that machine deliberately, as a test, and the machine had performed exactly as designed. Coyle had received the name, believed it, and passed it to Kersey with instructions to let the woman reach the grave. He had done all of this without ever asking whether the name was true. The grave had been chosen because it hid nothing. The name had been chosen because it meant nothing, except to the men who believed that every escape must leave a trail. The light had been carried because it was the only thing that could hold 4 armed men in one place through an entire night. And the real road, the road that mattered, had been left completely dark. That was the shape of the whole thing, and it held together so cleanly that it was difficult afterward to believe it had been planned at all. The lawsuit ended without a clear victory for either side. The court, faced with evidence that showed Coyle had supplied information to the hunters and that Kersey had acted on it, declined to award Kersey the full sum he sought. Some costs were ordered paid, the rewards were not. Coyle, for his part, was never prosecuted for his collaboration with the hunters, because collaboration of that kind was not, in that place and time, a crime. The notes remained in the court file. The sentence remained on the single sheet of paper, and the 2 men who had written and received it went back to their lives with the matter unresolved between them. Temperance Webb did not testify in the lawsuit. She remained on the Coyle property, working as she had always worked, stitching mourning clothes and carrying her lantern to the graves of the dead. She appears in the property's work records, such as they are, in the years that followed. She appears intermittently in the recollections of people who knew the district. And then, in 1864, in the 3rd year of the war that would eventually end the institution that held her, her name disappears from the records altogether. There is no note of sale, no note of death, no note of escape. She simply ceases to be recorded, as if the paper itself had lost track of her. Augustus Finch survived the war. He left Kentucky, made his way north, and settled in Ohio, where he worked for years in a brickyard and lived quietly. Decades later, in the 1890s, he told part of the story to a minister who was collecting the memories of formerly enslaved people, a project that would later be deposited in fragments in a church archive in a town on the Ohio side of the river. The minister's notes are brief and sometimes illegible. They record the outline of the escape, the role of the lantern, the trick of the false rumor, the name of the dead wagon master. They record that Augustus spoke of Temperance Webb with a particular care, as one speaks of a person who is no longer present, but whose absence is still felt. And they record one sentence, written in the minister's hand at the bottom of the last page, which reads, "He said she always knew where every road ended." Of the 3 men who escaped on the night of the 6th of November, 2 appear later in the public records of Cincinnati, in city directories and in a marriage register and in the rolls of a church on the west side of the city. The 3rd appears nowhere. There is no death record, no further entry, no trace. He may have gone farther north. He may have changed his name, as many did. He may have died on the road or on the river, unrecorded and unremembered. The minister's notes do not say. The court file does not say. The man simply ends, as far as the paper is concerned, on the night he crossed the water. Harlan Kersey lived to old age, and he never stopped telling the story. He told it in taverns and on porches and in the offices of men who had once hired him. He told it as a story about how close he had come, how nearly he had caught the 3 runaways, how the woman had almost led him straight to them. He said, almost. He said it for the rest of his life. The word was a kind of protection, a way of saying that the failure had been a matter of inches rather than of a whole night spent in the wrong place. His own papers showed otherwise. The ledger, the correspondence, the bundle of notes that he had brought into court and never taken back, all of it showed that he had never once been near the 3 men on the night they escaped. He had been on the cemetery road, following a light through the trees while the men he was hunting crossed the river, miles away, in the opposite direction. He had been certain, and his certainty had been the thing that was used against him. The distance between where he was and where the escape happened was not a matter of inches. It was the entire width of the plan. The detail that remained longest in the local memory of Mason County was not the lawsuit, not the unpaid rewards, not even the escape itself. It was the image of the lantern moving slowly along the cemetery road with 4 armed men following it in the dark. The image was told and retold, changed in the telling until it became something like a legend, the kind of story that people tell on winter evenings to explain why the cemetery road is best avoided after dark. In most versions, the woman in the story is a ghost. In most versions, the light floats above the ground. In most versions, the men who follow it are never heard from again. The record tells a different story. The woman was not a ghost. The light did not float. The men who followed it were not swallowed by the dark. They were simply kept there, in the one place they were sure they needed to be, while the thing they wanted moved away from them in the dark. What Temperance Webb did on that night was not magic, and it was not luck. It was something more patient and more difficult. She had spent weeks learning how the machine worked, learning where the information flowed, learning how much of it could be trusted. And then she had fed the machine a single piece of false certainty and let it run. She had understood that the men who hunted her people did not need to be defeated. They needed only to be occupied. They needed only to be given something to look at, something they believed in, something that would hold their attention while the real work happened out of sight. The lantern was never a guide. It was a distraction. It was the thing that kept them looking at the wrong grave, on the wrong road, in the wrong part of the night, while the true road, the river road, the water, the boat, the far shore, remained completely, deliberately, and safely dark. The folder in Maysville remains. The sentence remains. The single sheet of paper with Coyle's small, even hand remains. And somewhere in the margin of that paper, in the space between what the documents say and what they do not say, there is the outline of a woman walking through the trees with a lantern, leading 4 men not toward anything but away from everything. The world moved on, as the world does. The war came and ended, and the institution that held Temperance Webb and Augustus Finch and the 3 men who crossed the river came to an end with it. The property changed hands. The main house burned and was rebuilt. The cemetery fell into neglect, and the fence rotted, and the graves sank, and the spring dried up, and the road became a path and then a memory. The town of Maysville grew and changed, and forgot most of what it had once known. And yet, in the church archive in Ohio, the minister's notes remain, and in the courthouse annex, the folder remains, and in the local memory of the district, the image of the lantern remains. It is a small story, measured against the history that surrounded it. 4 men on a road, a woman with a light, a grave that hid nothing, a river crossed in the dark. But it is the kind of story that does not quite leave the mind, because it reverses the usual arrangement of things. The men who carried weapons and authority and the full weight of the law behind them were, for one entire night, completely at the mercy of a woman carrying nothing but a tin lantern. And she did not need to harm them. She did not need to confront them. She needed only to understand them, to know what they would believe and how they would act, and to place a single point of light in the exact spot where their certainty would do the most damage to itself. The hunters believed, all through that night, that they were following the one light that could lead them to the fugitives. The truth was simpler and colder. The lantern existed for a single purpose, and it fulfilled that purpose perfectly. It kept 4 men looking at the wrong grave, on the wrong road, in the wrong place, while the road that mattered, the real road, the one that led to the water and the boat and the far shore, remained entirely in the dark.